Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here. We are back by popular demand this morning with Dr. Paul Rozin, the world's expert in the psychology of food. So Paul and I last connected several weeks ago. I believe it was March 16th, when coronavirus was really coming more and more into our everyday. So Paul and I chatted about his thoughts on coronavirus impacts on the food industry. And today, since several weeks have passed, Paul graciously agreed to come back to chat with us about new developments and maybe some predictions for moving into the future and our new normal. So Paul, thank you so much for being here with us again this morning. And I have a list of questions for you. But before we dive into those, are there any thoughts that are maybe top of mind for you right now that you might like to share with our audience?
Well, good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on when you're watching this. Thank you very much, Marie. I have just a couple of things I've been concerned about recently. One of them is really about contagion, which I also work on, not about food, which is why no one was upset about influenza. We've had influenza around for a while. Just to give you a sense of this, 2 years ago, 60,000 Americans died of influenza. It comes every year. It's pretty serious, and nobody gets very upset about it. And nobody takes precautions. They're the same precautions, by the way. It's a virus similar to the coronavirus. So I've been interested in looking at basically the question is, will coronavirus recede into the status of influenza in a year or so? It's going to be another risk. We all live with risks, and we go on with life. Right now, this risk is center stage.
Yeah.
When it gets less, the risk gets lower, and we get used to it. And in addition, something else happens that gets our attention. I can tell you what that will be. It'll be the election. Maybe the news will stop devoting 90% of its time to this virus. So that's sort of gotten me interested. And another thing I've been interested in, I've been thinking about restaurants. I'm not a restaurant expert, though I eat a lot in them. But it seemed to me that there were two things that restaurants might be able to do to deal with the 50% claim, the idea that you could only have 50% of customers at any one time. You used to. And one of them was to expand eating times. So say go from 10 to midnight and give people a slight bonus, like 20% off the meal if they eat lunch at 10 or if they dinner at 11. So you could get more customers or 3 o'clock. And the other thing that was of the same sort was to make meals a little shorter. That is, reduce the time between when you order and when you get the food. Let's talk about a sit-down restaurant now.
Yep.
Time between courses. You could probably save 20% of time, and then you might get an extra sitting that way. And people might be willing to do that. In fact, they might be willing to do it if you gave them a 10% discount. I don't know, but I'm thinking of exploring that because I think it's probably going to be the case that very crowded restaurants are not going to be in for a while. And so the question is, how do you get your income when you can't get a crowd? And I'm just trying to think about ways to do that.
And Paul, you mentioned you've extensively studied contagion in addition to the psychology of food.
Yes.
So do you think Americans think differently about contagion, which is the spread of disease from one person to another in close contact? Do they think differently about that as compared to, say, a foodborne illness like E. coli or, say, general dirtiness or uncleanliness? Like, do we think about these things as the same sort of phenomenon?
So that's a very important question to which we don't know the answer. We have a system, a discussed contagion system, which it's universal. Okay, people vary in how much they ascribe to it, how sensitive they are, but it's there. Okay, so that system is not perfect. So dirt is a sign of infection. That is, something that's dirty is more likely to be contaminated. Something that smells bad is more likely to be contaminated. So that system registers those things as disgusting and avoids them, and that doesn't want to touch them and all of that. So there is some confusion between dirt and infectability. And interestingly, though, if you look at people who have obsessive compulsive disorder, what we call contamination obsessive compulsive disorder, these are people who wash their hands 20 times a day, you know, and are always worried about, but they're really worried about dirt. And they separate. I mean, they are worried about infection, but where their focus is dirt. Whereas germaphobes, which are much less common, they are concerned about germs. They're worried about sterilization all the time. So can't separate dirt from germs, but they are correlated, as are bad smells. Spoiled food is the most common time when we get bad smells, though of course we eat stinky cheese.
Yep.
Smells terrible. and people smell stinky cheese and they don't know it's cheese. They think it's terrible. So if you give someone something to smell and you say, this is cheese, well, someone who likes it, you say, oh, it smells great. Or you say, I'm sorry, that's cat poop. I gave you the wrong one. And they say, ooh, it smells terrible. The same smell. But of course, stinky cheese really stinks. And there are even people who say, I love it, but I have to get it past my nose. Meaning that they don't like the smell of it, but they like the taste of it. Because the taste is mostly the smell, you know. But
Yeah.
it smells different in your mouth than it smells out there. Doesn't smell stinky in your mouth. Fascinating thing. Anyway, so you're absolutely right that dirt is in a complicated way related to infection. And certainly a restaurant where anyone saw any kind of dirt around, maybe a piece of silverware that wasn't washed properly, is going to think for two reasons that they're in trouble. One is that might be a direct sign that there's infectious stuff around. And secondly, it suggests that they're not being careful.
So Paul, along those lines, we find in our data that consumers are really thinking about sanitation these days. So that's kind of the best practice a restaurant might do right now, is that actually you said it in our first interview, this notion of overt sanitation, just showing that we're taking these precautions is really important. So do you think that these new practices, especially that we're making as individuals, maybe washing our hands more or wearing gloves or things like that, is that going to be a short-term thing or maybe intermediate term? Or say another pandemic doesn't occur in the next several years, are we going to forget about these new ways and kind of go back to how we used to be? Or do you think we'll have a continued importance and focus on sanitation now just forever?
Well, first of all, nobody can predict anything. I mean, we know that in psychology. I mean, people are very bad at predicting anything general like that. They may be able to predict where they're going to park their car tomorrow, but that's a different kind of prediction.
Yeah.
I can predict that with great confidence when I'm not in isolation anymore. I have a spot. The thing is that people think they can predict better than they can, by the way. So, and just remember, nobody was taking precautions about influenza.
Yeah.
Ago, and it was a real threat. So, the general story is that people get used to things. One of the biggest phenomena in psychology is adaptation. People get used to things. They get used to getting old. Mm-hmm. Old people who are not very ill, like 70, 80-year-olds, are as happy as young people. They feel as their life is as good. Now, they have a lot of problems, but they got used to them.
Yeah.
You develop a sort of a baseline from which you work. So it is, people will get used to this, and this is going to get less, of course. But so that's one big thing. We get used to everything. We get used to death. We're all going to die, right? And we know that we're going to die, but not tomorrow, probably. And we just go through life. We don't sit around worrying about dying because we got used to that fact. So I think that's going to happen. And another thing that's very important in dropping the concern about this in restaurants and in general is something else comes up that's more important. Could be war with China, potential, it could be the election. So, in other words, you can only worry about a small number of things. People who worry about everything don't get anything done, right? So most people worry about a few things, and this is right at the top now. But it's not going to be right at the top when there's less of it, when we get used to it, and when other things come up. So I think that the answer is going to be generally yes. People are going to worry less about this. Now, are they going to go back to their previous behavior? My guess is mostly yes, but not entirely. So, for example, the habit is a very important thing for people. You know, you get used to doing things. When you go to the bathroom in the morning, you brush your teeth. You do it in a certain way, right? You don't have to do it that way. I mean, for example, do you put the toothpaste in your left or your right hand? You know, all that sort of stuff. It's automatic. And certain things that we're doing now may become part of our life, like washing your hands with soap. I don't use soap much. I didn't use soap. I use soap now. And my guess is more now for my hands. And my guess is I will. Now, there's a lot of differences between people. So contagion and disgust differ enormously among people. So I'm not very disgust or contagion sensitive. So I don't have any problem, eating if there's a cockroach near me. Not in my plate, but some people would just stop eating. I know someone who won't blow her nose in a brand new piece of toilet paper coming right off the package. So it's been on a roll. It never even occurred to me that was a problem, okay? So you got an enormous range of concern. And about contagion. There are people who don't feel comfortable being in a room with someone who has a cold.
Yeah.
People who don't even notice it. And there's culture differences too, which you're not concerned about with American restaurants, but there are, every culture has a lot of variation, but some are more or less sensitive than others. So the answer is, will this raise our contagion sensitivity for a long time? I'm guessing not. Will it probably affect a few behaviors that we got used to in this situation and we expect now.
But it sounds like overall this idea of habit is very powerful, and we might get used to some of these new practices, like maybe washing our hands more often or some things based on what becomes habit to us over these couple of months.
Yes, and another thing is that we are developing new habits. So for example, most people, including myself, I had not ordered online groceries before.
Yeah.
Now I've ordered online groceries. It isn't great.
Yeah.
I still much would prefer to go to the store. But, you know, if it was raining, I might do it or something. But the point is that we have new possibilities have opened for us. Also ordering online from a restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
I think I ever ordered online from a good restaurant. But, you know, once you start doing that, then you realize, oh, that's possible. It's like learning a new, gadget. I mean, you originally thought, I'm not going to like that. And then you get to work with it and you say, oh, that's pretty good. Or this is pretty good. So that then becomes a habit. So there are new possibilities that are opening up. And of course, online grocery shopping and restaurants is getting better. That is to say, you know, right now, if you have a supermarket you like, they don't have all the things in the supermarket online.
Yeah.
So I know things I like and they're not online. No, I can call the market and get them to deliver it, but you know, that's complicated. So the point is they'll be much better at getting all the stuff there, all the menu items available to you. Even they'll figure out ways to make something that's a little fragile. That is to say, that doesn't last very long. Maybe they'll figure out ways, restaurants will, to make that a takeout item. I think restaurants are going to learn how to do this. Right now, you know, certain cuisines, like Indian cuisine, a lot of Indian food is, you know, stewed. It's very easy to send out. There will be advances. But right now, online shopping or online eating in restaurants is not nearly as good. Never mind the ambience.
So Paul, we find we've been surveying consumers. I think we've talked to 60,000 people at this point since early March. And we continue to find that people are turning toward comfort foods right now and familiar foods. And, we want things that are comforting and not necessarily new or unusual. What do you think is driving that? Do you think it's as simple as that when times are uncertain that we are drawn to things that are familiar to us?
I think that's very little evidence on this, but I think it's true. It is also said that when immigrant people go into the hospital or something, they really want their home cuisine. So I don't know if that's what it said.
Yeah.
But it sounds right to me that you, just like you want to be around your family when you're stressed, you might want your fundamental food. Now, why comfort foods are comfort foods, I don't know. So I never understood what comfort foods were, actually. Macaroni and cheese, they say. That's a big one, right?
Yes.
What are the other comfort foods?
Maybe lasagna, maybe pizza. I think of it as things that you had as a child that almost are nostalgic to us.
Because, nobody had pizza in this country before World War II. So new comfort food. It only came from Italy and after World War II. So, but it is the most popular food in the United States.
Yeah.
So it's something you eat a lot. I mean, is that what it is? I mean, because I don't understand the concept actually.
Is there anything for you that you turn to if you're, feeling sad or down and you're like, oh, I wish I could have a warm bowl of pasta or anything like that?
No, I think I like something really good all the time, especially when I'm sad maybe. But it's not, it could be a lobster dish, which I don't have often.
Yeah.
Nobody eats lobster often. Well, maybe if you live in Maine, I guess. But now that they're eating a lot of them, they may want a little release from that. So that's because a restaurant provides that. And we have this, probably more than any one place in the world, we have this enormous variety of foods and of ethnic foods, because we don't have a basic cuisine in the United States. What's American food?
Yeah.
If you ask a French person what's French food, Chinese person what's Chinese, they know exactly what you're talking about. Nobody knows what American food is because we're so multi-ethnic. So we can't go to that type of comfort food.
Burgers, hamburgers?
Yeah, of course, yes. And now burgers, of course, they're not an American food, but we like pizza. We've adopted them. Yeah, they are very American. But I mean, if you wanted to say to someone, I want to go out for an American meal at a reasonably good restaurant now, not at fast food. I mean, it's not, there are American restaurants, but they serve all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, very diverse menu. Yeah. And so, thinking people don't get tired of comfort food, do you have any thoughts on how long this shift toward comfort food might last? We have a hypothesis that it will be short to intermediate term, and we won't want to be eating these things forever. We'll want new foods. So is it maybe a function of when the uncertainty starts to melt away, or maybe, like you mentioned, when the election starts taking up the news and it's less kind of coronavirus all the time?
Well, the big thing is when you can get to restaurants.
Yeah.
Because most people don't make a great variety of food at home. Where you get Chinese food, you might probably make Italian food at home. Italian is a very home food for Americans.
Yeah.
Lasagna, pizza. Two of the things you mentioned are Italian, right? But Chinese food, Mexican food, for people who aren't native to those, but it's something you probably don't make that much at home. So I like it, you're going to go out and get it normally. So I think you'll be glad to get out to those places once you eat it. Now, you should know, again, the seeking for variety is something that has been well studied in psychology, and it's a big individual difference. You have people who eat the same thing for lunch every day, and you have people who would never eat the same thing for lunch every day.
Yeah.
I have friends, if you say, let's go out for Chinese food, and they'll say, I ate Chinese yesterday. The Chinese eat Chinese food every day. It's probably the world's greatest cuisine. Who cares? But they are trying to impose variety at all costs. So you have this whole range, and you have a lot of people in the middle. I mean, people go to China for a trip and they eat Chinese food for 2 weeks. They may get tired of it. I don't know if they do or not. There is a desire in a lot of people to have some variety in their diet.
Yeah.
And eating only comfort food, that's gonna build up, and they're gonna want to get out. I don't think there's any problem with getting people out to, say, ethnic restaurants once they're available and they feel it's safe.
Yeah, we think so too. We agree that variety is important, and people are going to want to shift away from comfort and familiar pretty quickly. So another interesting question I wanted to ask you is, you mentioned how people are adapting differently to this situation. So at one extreme, somebody might be totally germaphobe, not leaving their house during this time. At another extreme, somebody might be totally cavalier about it and not worried at all. What informs those decisions for us, and how is it that we all kind of, in some way, end up finding our own working routine in uncertain times like this?
Okay, well, good. That's a good question. First of all, let's be very clear. The risk here is quite low for a healthy younger person.
Yep.
It's lower probably now than it was for influenza at various times, which they paid no attention to. But for someone, older person like me, it's very high.
Yep.
One big difference between people is the actual risk, and they generally know this. Because there's a lot of it on the news that you might be young, but if you go home and you're living with your grandparent, you have to be careful, all that sort of stuff. But this is a question about personality. People have personalities, and they're pretty stable through their lifetime, and some people are very afraid of things, afraid of germs, others aren't. You're going to have this wide variety of things, and of course it relates to what the risk is.
Mm-hmm.
Risk is high for older people, low for younger people. So you've got two things going on: how sensitive you are, how much you're going to modify your behavior because of a threat, and how big the threat is. So the threat's going to go down, we all agree. It may pop up again. We don't know. We don't know the history of this.
Yeah.
We don't. The experts, as you can tell from the fact that the estimates for how many Americans are going to die keep changing.
Yeah.
Right? Those are the experts, and they just don't know enough to conclude everything. Things can happen which will change the way people behave, like another crisis, like something else that the president says. All sorts of things change this, and we can't predict those things. So yes, there is a wide variety of attitudes to contagion, to food, to how much variety you like in your food. By the way, to how important food is in your life. There are some people for whom food is the center of life, and other people think it's a necessity, and it's okay.
It's kind of like COVID is exposing some inequities or inadequacies of our food system. So, I've read about crops being left on the field and food being just wasted. It has nowhere to go, sort of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think this is going to help ignite change in our food system? And can you think of any points in the supply chain or maybe technology disruptions that might occur or that should occur because of this?
Well, might and should are very different. You are absolutely right to point to the slaughterhouses. But by the way, they're not. They're sometimes referred to as slaughterhouses, but what you see is the dividing of a piece of meat into smaller pieces.
Yep.
I mean, you don't see the slaughtering, but that, you were right. That could affect things. People are more aware, and this whole thing, they're more aware of how much we depend on other countries, because they're always, something that's in short supply. I don't think they were as aware of that. There's going to be more of a movement to make our own drugs, for example. So I think the inequities, when you look at who gets COVID and who dies from it, largely it's poor people of color. And that's primarily, I think, because they have jobs which require them to work outside in the world.
Yep.
There are a lot of reasons, but that's a big one. They have to work, whereas we can afford to sit at home and do our work on a computer.
Right.
So, but that's bringing home the inequities in American culture, which I happen to care a lot about. And I don't know if that's going to have an effect or not, but it's certainly in the face of a lot of people because it's on the news.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be interesting to kind of see how it continues to progress.
So it's very difficult to predict when a movement will take hold and when it will die off.
Right.
The movement to not eat meat, which I work on, is pretty a steady, slow. There's a growing number of people who are reducing their meat intake in this all over the world, all over the developed world. In the developing world, meat is a special thing and it's sought after.
Mm-hmm.
But it's happening very slowly. No great events, but who knows? So, because that won't have a big effect on restaurants, or just change the range of foods that they serve, the amount of food they would serve of different sorts. All restaurants, almost all serve both meat and not meat. Now, as you get imitation meats coming along, which are very good,
Mm-hmm.
like Beyond Meat or Impossible Burgers or other things, there's becoming an alternative to meat, which wasn't there before. It was there in Chinese cuisine, by the way. Chinese vegetarian cuisine makes things that are like meat, made of gluten or
soy. Yep.
Yeah, but that was a very special, unique group. Nobody even knew about it. But this is different.
Yeah.
So again, whether these things really start growing, I'm guessing maybe, because there are three forces to get people to eat more meat. We're not talking about COVID anymore, but one is that people think it's healthier not to eat meat.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I said. People think. I didn't say it wasn't. Secondly, they don't like the idea of killing animals. And thirdly, they're getting sensitive to the fact that we got too many people in the world and we don't have enough land to grow the food. And animals aren't an efficient way of dealing with the world. It takes a lot more energy to get a pound of steak than to get a pound of corn.
Plant-based was such a big trend leading up to COVID, and we were curious. We wanted to understand, is it going to continue that way post all of what's happened over the past several weeks? So we just surveyed consumers about it, and I believe it was 86% of people said that they were interested in plant-based eating prior to the pandemic, say that they will continue to be interested once we kind of move into our new normal. So it seems that it's going to continue to be quite a large trend in our industry.
86%, you said, of people were interested in plant-based eating.
86% said of those who were interested in plant-based eating before the pandemic happened, 86% say they'll continue to be once we're out of this.
Yeah, I wouldn't think this would change that, though it is generally true, that animal food is the source of microorganisms. Because they live in animals.
Yep.
Now, that's not true in particular situations, for example, where feces is used as a fertilizer, as in many developing countries. So you're getting an animal food, piece of animal life, onto plants. So in Mexico, for example, the risk of getting sick from food is probably more from lettuce, which is first of all eaten raw.
Yeah.
Often contaminated, as opposed to meat, which is cooked and is probably okay anyway. But it's generally true that toxins come from plants and infections come from animals. The reason for that is these organisms, we're like animals, right? So if they can live in a cow, they can live in a bat, they can probably live in a human. But if they live on a carrot, that doesn't, that doesn't make them adapted to living in us.
Interesting. Well, Paul, one of my colleagues asked me if I would ask you what it would take for you to go back to a restaurant if you could. And we talked a bit about how you're kind of in a higher risk group earlier. So
yes.
Certainly know that might impact your decision, but would you be willing to share any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I'm a really weird, there's a very very small percentage of Americans are like me. I love all the foods of the world. I eat a lot of ethnic food, even some at home. And I'm a low risk, I'm a person at high risk for COVID and any infection, but I'm a low risk person in general. I go to markets in developing countries and eat. I don't eat uncooked food, by the way.
Yeah.
So that's a big one. Uncooked vegetables are a problem.
Yeah.
If you don't know the restaurant. Now, in the United States, it's not much of a problem. So I would go to eat in an ethnic, I have lots of lovely ethnic restaurants I go to. If it was not too crowded, I would probably go fairly soon.
I remember you and I both have eaten at Vernick Fish in Philly, which was an amazing restaurant.
Yes. And you didn't go up to the top, right?
I think I did. I believe I did, to that bar at the top of that. Is it
the mirrors and the view of the whole city is gorgeous.
Yeah.
And a fancy French restaurant, which I haven't eaten at, is up there too. But it's worth eating at Vernick Fish and then going up 60 floors to the top just to see the spectacle.
Yes, and that's a perfect example of just the added kind of ambiance and special experience beyond the food that a place like Vernick Fish offers if you dine in there, and you just don't get all of that if you maybe, have it delivered or taken out.
No, that's true. And I was in Italy for 3 weeks 2 years ago. I ate some very fine, 2-star Michelin meals. But the best meal I ate was in a little town, and it was just a seafood restaurant, and it was a family restaurant. The food was delicious, but all the families were there, and they were enjoying their food and making noise, and it was just wonderful. The whole setting was wonderful. And the food was delicious, simple but delicious. And it's the best meal I had on that trip.
Wow.
The ambience and the quality of the food was excellent. But so if you ask people, I once did this, you ask people what was the best meal of their life, okay? And they would write down on a survey what the best meal was. Well, only a moderate percent of them were a great meal, what you would call a great meal. Half of them were at home. A meal at their mother's house, or it could have been a repeated meal that they had at their grandmother's house or something. And then there were other special ones. I remember one had a meal at Hardee's.
Oh, wow.
And he described the meal in detail. And it turns out he had been in prison for 3 years. And this was the first meal he had. So, what I'm trying to say is that a great meal is a lot of different things. But the ambience, the greatest meal I've ever had, without any question, was at El Bulli in Spain.
Yeah.
It was a 34-course meal that lasted 6 hours.
Wow.
And every dish was an adventure. And, the ambience was wonderful. Everything was wonderful. And I was eating with people I love. That's another thing, by the way. Who are you eating with?
Yeah.
A friend you haven't seen in a while? That's awfully nice.
Uh-huh.
So a meal at a good restaurant, or just I don't mean necessarily fancy, with someone you really care about, is an experience with that person, eating with that person. So there's a lot that goes on in eating out. I think restaurants are a wonderful thing. They're a new thing, They're only a few hundred years old.
Restaurants, interesting. Where was the first restaurant that we know of?
I don't know if we know that. It's probably France, but there were inns where you stayed and they gave you food.
Okay.
So that's sort of like a restaurant, but there weren't places that you just went to eat.
Interesting.
And of course, they've taken over the world.
Yes. Well, Paul, you mentioned, can you remind our audience what you talked about at Foodscape about the importance of the end of something, maybe specifically the end of a meal? And can we take those learnings and apply them to post-COVID restaurant processes at all? Like, could we provide maybe a sanitary hand wipe at the end of a meal now? Or would it be something to do with the end of the meal itself regarding the food that could maybe help enhance the experience?
Well, generally speaking, as Shakespeare said, all's well that ends well.
Mm-hmm.
And in general, the ending of an experience has a bigger role in your memory for the experience. Your memory of an interesting meal is probably almost absent, but your memory of a good meal is very important, because someone says to you, how was that meal at X restaurant? You say it was wonderful. Now that's your memory that you're talking about. You're talking about your memory for that meal is wonderful, right?
Yeah.
You don't have the actual meal in your head. So the ending of a meal is important for communicating how good something is. And it also, it's sort of dumb. It's very important in your overall experience of a meal. And I raise this issue because dessert is not the most favored dish by most people. And yet we end our meals in dessert, again, because of a French tradition. There's much said for it, but you should actually end the meal with the best thing you have. So I've suggested to chefs, say a tasting menu, which has, say, 10 dishes. After the 9th dish, you give them a picture of every dish they've had. So you're gonna have one of these again. Which one do you want? So you know to end with a good dish because they picked it, right? Now your question is, how does this, oh, by the way, just let me give you another example from a total different area. You go to a baseball game, okay, your home team is losing 2-0, and they made errors, they're playing terribly, and you're suffering. In the 9th inning, they score 3 runs, and they win 3-2, okay? And you go out of the stadium and someone says, how was the game? And you say, it was a great game, right? Great game. You won. What an exciting thing. You suffered for 8 innings, but it ended well, right?
Right. So it's a success because it's a success because it ended well.
Yeah. So it's not that extreme with the food, because if you have 6 good courses or 4 good courses and then have something that's not so good, you won't say it's a bad meal, but it does matter. And so that's, now what you suggested is interesting, that if a meal ends on a sanitary note, does that have more effect? It should have more effect at the beginning of the meal, right? Because it's going to affect your exposure.
And what you touch, yeah.
But where at the end of a meal, if someone comes and gives you a hand wipe, and you use that hand wipe, and it's hot, maybe even better, that may make the memory of that meal better and memory of safer. I don't know. It's an interesting idea because, again, what comes last matters a lot. Yep.
Interesting. So there might be something there, especially knowing what we know right now with the importance of overt sanitation.
Yes, a display of ritual sanitation at the end of a meal might be actually good.
Ironically, Paul, I think that brings us to the end of our interview. I know we would love to have you back in a couple weeks if you would be willing to join us again.
Sure.
Is there anything that we haven't covered that you would want to share today?
Well, I think you've covered a lot.
Yes, I think we covered quite a lot.
And your questions are good, and I'm hoping for the restaurant industry personally, because I care about it, and because I think it's a good institution that we should have. And I think it's going to suffer a little for a while. I mean, it has, but it's going to take a while to get back to full. Because as you know, one of the problems with restaurants is that they have peak customers. There's not anybody there for a while. Businesses like stores that aren't like that. People are coming in all the time. So restaurants have this problem of large numbers and then nothing. And that makes it more difficult in this environment.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with the spacing out the meals at sit-down restaurants like we talked about earlier. If Americans start to eat at more varied times, and if that opens up more eating occasions for a restaurant in a day.
Yeah, maybe also, I'm just thinking out loud, it may be that in some places, not very fancy places, you could go and get the food. It would be like a regular restaurant, but the food would be served, at the kitchen on a counter or something. I'm just thinking of making it a little faster. That's all.
Yeah.
Waiters would not be happy with this. And I think they're wonderful people. So
yes, I agree.
Restaurant experience is it's the standard dating experience, right, in our culture. You go out for a drink or a dinner.
Yep. So
it's such an important part of our world. I'm for it.
I'm for it too. Absolutely. Well, Paul, thank you so much. Thank you very much for your time. This has been awesome. And, we'll also look forward to your questions if you want to submit any questions.
I've already written a few, yeah.
Oh, perfect. Okay, well, thank you so much, Paul, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you.
Okay, great.